You are listening to PastThink.com audiobook. Please like and subscribe, thank you. Chapter 64. 5 fair women make subjects for a chaste maid's verse, and 9 jade dragons make a love gift for a flirt. As soon as Cao Xueqin learned that everything was ready, he returned to the temple and reported to his father to that effect. At once preparations for the procession into the city were put in motion. Bearers were organized, insignia, funeral banners, and all the other paraphernalia got ready overnight, and messengers hurriedly sent out to relations and friends telling them when the procession would set out, 5 o'clock on the morning of the 4th. The procession, needless to say, was of dazzling magnificence, and troops of mourners took part in it. It provoked varying reactions from the crowd numbering many thousands who lined the road to watch it, all the way from the Temple of the Iron Threshold to the gates of Ningguo House. Some took a simple pleasure in the spectacle, others admired the wealth which had created it, but there were also a few sour-faced Confucian scholars who looked down their noses and muttered something about sumptuousness being no substitute for grief. A buzz of discussion followed its passing all along the route. The procession reached the mansion at about 3 in the afternoon. The coffin was deposited in its shrine in the main hall. Offerings were made, the lament was raised. After that the mourners began gradually to depart. Only those members of the Jia clan remained who had undertaken to lend the family a hand with the reception. Among relations not of the Jia surname, the only one to stay behind was Lady Xing's brother, Xing Dequan. As long as there were visitors around, convention obliged cousin Jin and Cao Xueqin to remain in appropriately grief-stricken attitudes beside the coffin, conforming, as far as possible, to the scriptural canons on mourning which enjoin the bereaved son, among other things, to lie upon rushes with a sod of earth for his pillow, but as soon as the last guest had gone, they were off like a shot to enjoy the society of their young female relations inside. Throughout this period Bao Yu too was expected to put on mourning, and go over every day to Ningguo House to spend the whole day there beside the coffin. Shi Feng was not well enough to go over daily, but on days when there were sutra readings, and the callers were numerous, she would drag herself over and lend Yusha a hand in entertaining the wives. One morning after the early offering, when cousin Jin and Cao Xueqin, worn out by a succession of short nights and long, exhausting days, lay dozing beside the coffin, Bao Yu thought that as there were no visitors he might just as well go back home and see Dai Yu. Calling at Green Delights on the way, he found the courtyard silent and deserted. In the coolness of the surrounding gallery a few old women and junior maids were sitting or lying about in various postures of sleep. He had no wish to disturb them, and would have made his way into the house alone, but just as he was approaching the doorway, number 4 caught sight of him and started up, intending to raise the blind for him to enter. She had not time to do so however, for at that very moment Parfumie came rushing out and very nearly ran into him. She checked herself just in time. "What are you doing here?" There was an expression of pleased surprise on her face. "Don't let Skybright get me. She's trying to hit me." Inside the room there was a clatter of numerous tiny objects striking the floor, and a moment later Skybright burst through the doorway in pursuit. "Where are you, you little wretch? If you've lost, you have to have a slap. It's no good running to Bao Yu to protect you, he isn't here today." Bao Yu laughingly intercepted her. "She's only little. I don't know how she's offended you, but won't you forgive her for my sake?" Bao Yu's sudden appearance at that moment was so unexpected that Skybright found it comical. "Parfumie must be a little witch. I wouldn't have thought even magic spells could bring someone so quickly." "Well, I don't care," she said, having recovered somewhat from her surprise. "Magic or no magic, I'm going to get her." She wrested the arm free that Bao Yu was holding and darted at Parfumie, but Parfumie dodged behind Bao Yu's back and clung to him. Bao Yu took Skybright by one hand and Parfumie by the other and walked with them into the room. There on the Kong under the west wall, Musk, Ripple, Emerald and Swallow sat playing dibs, melon seeds for winners and slaps for losers. Parfumie had lost to Skybright and run out to avoid the slap. The clattering noise that Bao Yu had heard was the sound of dibstones falling from Skybright's lap when she got up to chase her. Bao Yu surveyed the scene approvingly. "I thought you'd be a bit quiet here with me away," he said. "And as the days are so long now, I was afraid you might be going to sleep after lunch and making yourselves ill. I'm glad you've found a way of keeping yourselves amused. Where's Aroma?" he asked, suddenly noticing that she was not with them. "Oh, Aroma," said Skybright. "Aroma's gone religious. She's sitting on her own in the next room like Bodhidharma, with her face to the wall. I haven't dared disturb her, so I haven't the least idea what she's doing. Whatever it is, she's being very quiet about it. You'd better go in and have a look, perhaps she's attained enlightenment." Bao Yu laughed and went into the inner room. He found Aroma sitting on the couch by the window making knots in a length of gray silk cord. She rose to her feet as he entered. "What lies has that wretch Skybright been telling about me? I wanted to get on with this knotting, that's what I came in here for. I hadn't got time to fool about with the others, so I pretended that I wanted to take advantage of your being away by sitting here quietly on my own and meditating for a bit." "Bodhidharma, indeed. I'll pinch that girl's mouth." Bao Yu laughed and sat down beside her to watch her knot. "The days are so long now, you ought to take a break of some kind. If you don't fancy playing with the others, why not come with me to see Cousin Lin? Surely it's much too hot for knotting? I noticed that you're still wearing that old black fan cover we made for you when you went into mourning for Mrs. Rong. As long as you were only wearing it once or twice a year, it didn't seem worth the trouble of replacing it, but now that you have to wear summer mourning every day at the other house, I thought it was high time I made you a new one. As soon as I've finished this cord for it, you can take the old one off and put it on. I know you don't care very much about this sort of thing, but if her old ladyship were to see you wearing the old one when she got back, she'd be sure to blame me for neglecting you. She'd say I was too lazy even to notice what you were wearing." Bao Yu smiled. "It's very nice of you to have thought about it. But don't drive yourself too hard. You don't want to give yourself a heat stroke." At that moment Parfumey came in carrying a cup of water-cooled tea for him on a tray. Because as a little boy he had been delicate, Bao Yu was never given ice-cold tea to drink in summer. To cool his tea they plunged the teapot into a basin of water freshly drawn from the well. The water was changed several times until the tea inside the pot, though not chilled, had reached a pleasant freshness. He drank half the contents of the cup while Parfumed held it to his lips, then turned his head back again to address Aroma. "I told Tea Leaf when I left that if anyone important turns up at Cousin Jin's, he is to let me know immediately, otherwise I shan't be going back there." He got up to go. As he was leaving the house, he called back to Emerald and the others in the outer room. "If I'm wanted for anything, you'll find me at Miss Lin's." On his way there, just as he was about to cross Drenched Blossoms Bridge, he came upon Snowgoose followed by two old women carrying an assortment of caltrops, melons and lotus roots. "What are they for?" Bao Yu asked her. "I know your mistress never eats that sort of thing. Is she expecting Mrs. Ju or someone?" "If I tell you, you mustn't let on when you see her," said Snowgoose. Bao Yu nodded. "You can go on ahead and give that stuff to Miss Nightingale," Snowgoose said to the two women. "If she asks you why I'm not with you, tell her I'm doing something and I'll be back directly." The women made some reply and continued on their way. Snowgoose waited until they were out of earshot. "The mistress has been feeling a bit better this last day or two. But when Miss Tan looked in after lunch today and wanted her to go with her to call on Mrs. Lien, she wouldn't go. She appeared to be thinking about something and had a little cry. Then presently she picked up her writing brush and did a lot of writing, poetry I think. She told me to send out for some melons and things. While I did that, she said, Nightingale was to clear the cheen table in the inner room, move it into the outside room, and put the dragon incense burner on it. She said she'd tell us what to do with the melons when I got back. If she's planning to entertain someone, I don't see what she wants the incense burner for, certainly not for burning incense in, because she doesn't like incense as a rule. She likes to have fresh flowers and fruit and gourds about her, but not incense, because she doesn't like the smell of it in her clothes. Anyway, if she does want to burn some, why not in the inner room, where she spends all her time? Unless it's because the old women have made the outer room a bit smelly, and she's burning it to get rid of the smell. The fact is, I really don't know. You'll have to go and find out for yourself. While she was speaking, Bao Yu had unconsciously lowered his head. From what Snowgoose says, he thought, there must be some other reason for this. She wouldn't have things put out specially if she were merely entertaining one of the girls. Perhaps today is the anniversary of Aunt Lin's death. No, just a bit, it can't be. When it is, Grandma always sends her the stuff for the offering, and she's done that already this year. Perhaps it's for a seasonal offering. Perhaps she's been reading the doctrine of the mean. In each season of the year, offer things seasonable. It's possible. If I go and see her now, when she is feeling upset, I am sure to want to talk her out of it, and shall probably only succeed in causing her to suppress her grief. On the other hand, if I don't go, then with no one there to stop her, she may simply go on getting more and more upset. Either way will be bad for her. The best thing will be for me to go and see Cousin Feng first, sit with her for a bit, and look in at Cousin Lin's on my way back. Then, if she is still upset, I shall try to find some means of consoling her. In that way I shall be able to prevent her grief from getting out of hand, though at the same time she will have had a chance of giving it expression, so that there will be no danger of its being unhealthily repressed. Having come to this decision, he let Snowgoose go on to the Naiad's house alone, and made his way out of the garden to Shifeng's place. He arrived just as a number of women servants who had been reporting on household matters were leaving. Shifeng herself was leaning inside the gateway talking to patients. She smiled at Bao Yu as she saw him come. "You've come back, then? I've just this moment been telling Lin Jixiao's wife to send someone over to the other place to tell your pages that if you don't appear to be doing anything they ought to slip in and ask you to come back here for a rest. I was afraid that in this hot weather with so many people milling around there, you might find the sweaty smells a bit too much for you. But you've come back anyway, so I needn't have bothered." "Thank you for the kind thought, though," said Bao Yu. "I decided to come back here partly because there was nothing there for me to do, but also because I noticed that you haven't been over there for some days and I wanted to see if you were all right. How are you feeling lately?" "Oh, still pretty much the same," said Shifeng. "Still up one day and down the next. Now that grandmother and your mother are away, those senior women are getting quite out of hand, fighting or quarreling about something or other every day. We've even had cases of gambling and thieving recently. Of course, your sister is a great help, but she's a young unmarried girl, and there are certain things she can't be told about. When they crop up, I have to struggle out of bed and deal with them myself. So I don't really get a lot of rest. Under the circumstances there's not much prospect yet of getting better. All I can hope is that I shan't get any worse." "I know. But you've got to look after yourself," said Bao Yu. "You must try not to worry so much." He chatted with her a little longer before going back into the garden. Arriving at the Naiad's house, he could see the remains of incense smoke as he entered the courtyard gate. In the outer room there was a wet patch on the flagstones where a libation had been poured, and Nightingale was supervising the removal of the chin table to the inside room, and the replacement of various other objects and bits of furniture. Concluding that the little service, if that is what it had been, must just be over, he went inside. Dai Yu was lying down with her face to the wall. She looked ill and exhausted. At the sound of Nightingale's master bow, "Miss," she raised herself wearily, though with a smiling face, and invited him to sit by her. "How have you been these last few days, cuz?" he said. "You look a bit calmer than you did, but something seems to have been upsetting you." "I can't imagine why you should say so," said Dai Yu. "I am perfectly all right." "How can you expect me to believe that?" said Bao Yu. "The tears are still wet on your face. You should learn to take things a bit easier." It is bad for a person who has so much illness to be constantly indulging in grief. If you end up by undermining your health, The realization that what he was about to say was probably something that ought not to be said caused the words to stick in his throat. For although, from the fact that he and Dayu had grown up together, there existed a most perfect sympathy between them, although there was nothing in the world that either of them wanted more than to live and die in each other's company, the understanding that this was so was a wordless one which had never been expressed. In the past, because Dayu was so sensitive, words had all too often proved a stumbling block. And now today, when the whole point of his coming here was to comfort her, here he was again, on the point of saying something that would offend her. Finding that he could not go on, a sort of panic gripped him. He feared he was going to make her angry, and yet he so desperately wanted to help her. As he thought about it, the panic gave way to a feeling of helpless sadness, and he began to cry. Dayu, sensing that he was about to make one of those extravagant statements that she always found so irritating, had indeed been on the point of getting angry, but when she saw his internal struggle, and the tears which followed it, she felt not angry with him but moved, and being herself of a tearful disposition, was soon sitting there in silence and weeping with him for company. To Nightingale, who came in at that moment with some tea, it appeared as if they must have been having a quarrel. Just when Miss Lin is getting along nicely, she said to Bao Yu with some asperity, "What do you mean by coming along here and upsetting her?" Bao Yu laughed and wiped his eyes. "I've done no such thing." To cover up his embarrassment, he got up and began pacing about the room. In doing so, he caught sight of a sheet of paper sticking out from underneath Dayu's inkstone. The temptation to reach out and pick it up proved irresistible, and before Dayu could get up and snatch it from him, he had put it in the bosom of his gown. "Let me read it, Dai." "Whatever you come here about," said Dayu, "you always seem to end up by nosing through my papers." Bao Chai came in while she was speaking. "What is it you want to read, cousin?" she asked Bao Yu. Bao Yu still had no idea what the piece of paper contained, and because he was uncertain what Dayu's feelings would be about his reading it, he hesitated to answer Bao Chai's question for fear of giving Dayu offense. He therefore smiled and said nothing, while all the time his eyes rested on Dayu questioningly. Dayu smiled at Bao Chai and invited her to be seated. "I've been looking at some lives of famous women," said Dayu, "all of them women who are famous in history for their beauty or intelligence. There was so much I found moving, heartening and admirable in some cases, tragic and deplorable in others, that after lunch today, having nothing better to do, I decided to make a selection of them and try writing poems about them in which some of those feelings could be expressed." Then Tan Chun came in and asked me to go with her to see Cousin Feng, but I didn't feel up to it. After doing only 5 of the poems I had planned, I suddenly felt too tired to go on and left them lying there on the table, little thinking that Master Bao would come along and discover them. I wouldn't really mind his seeing them if it weren't for the fear that he might go copying them out and showing them to other people. "When did I ever do such a thing?" said Bao Yu indignantly. "If you're referring to the white crabflower poems on that fan, I wrote them on it myself in small kaishu characters merely for the convenience of always having them by me when I wanted to look at them. I fully realize that poems written in the privacy of the women's quarters are not lightly to be passed around outside. Ever since you spoke to me about it, I have been careful not to carry that fan with me anywhere but inside the garden." "Cousin Lin is right to be worried," said Bao Chai. "Now that the poems are written on that fan, there is always the possibility that you might one day forget and carry it with you to your room outside. Suppose Uncle's literary gentlemen were to see it there, they would be sure to ask you who the poems were by. If as a result of that they were to become public property, it would be extremely unpleasant for us. A stupid woman is a virtuous one, that is what the old proverb says. A girl's first concern is to be virtuous, her second is to be industrious. She may write poetry if she likes as a diversion, but it is an accomplishment she could just as well do without. The last thing girls of good family need is a literary reputation." She paused and gave Dayu a smile. "There would be no harm in letting me see them, of course. The important thing is not to allow Cousin Bao to go off with them." In the light of what you have just been saying, said Dayu drily, I'm not at all sure that I ought to let you look at them either. Anyway, she pointed to Bao Yu, he's already got them. Bao Yu assumed from her tone that he might read them. Extracting the paper from the inside pocket of his gown, he drew up close to Bao Chai, so that the two of them could peruse it together. This is what they read. She sure. That kingdom-quelling beauty dissolved like the flower of foam. In the foreign palace, she sure, did you yearn for your old home? Who laughs at your ugly neighbor with her frown and simper now? Still steeping her yarn at the brookside, and the hair snow-white on her brow? UG. The very crows are grieving as they caw in the cold night air. She faces her beaten tyrant king with a haggard look of despair. Let the others wait for the hangman, to be hacked and quartered and rent. Better the taste of one's own steel in the decent dark of a tent. Lady Bright. To a loveliness that dazzled, the palace of Han showed the door. For the fair are mostly ill-fated, as has been said often before. Yet it seems strange that an emperor, even one with such tepid views, should abandon his eye's own judgment, and let a painter choose. Green pearl. Pebble or pearl, to Shi Chong it was only a rich man's whim. Do you really believe your undoubted charms meant so very much to him? It was fate, from some past life preordained, that made him take his rash stand. And the craving to have a companion in death's dark, silent land. Red duster. She marked the firm, courteous protest, the well-phrased confident plan. And, under the unsuccessful clerk, saw the essential man. The great Yang Su in her eyes was finished from that hour. He could not hold a girl like her for all his pomp and power. After praising the poems enthusiastically, Bao Yu suggested that, as there were 5 of them, a good collective title would be Songs for 5 Fair Women, and without waiting for Dayu's approval, he picked up her writing brush and wrote it on the left-hand side of the sheet after the poems. Whatever subject one chooses for a poem, said Bao Chai, it is important that one's treatment of it should be original. If one merely plods along in the footsteps of earlier poets, it doesn't matter how fine the language is, the lack of originality will prevent it from being a really good poem. Thus, many poets have taken Lady Bright as their theme, but the best ones have always contrived to give the subject a new turn, one emphasizing the sad fate of Lady Bright herself, another the wickedness of the painter Ma Yanshou, another the frivolousness of the Han Emperor, who employed him to paint portraits of court ladies rather than portraits of distinguished statesmen and soldiers, and so on. Further new twists were given to this theme by Wang Anshi. What brush could ever capture a beauty's breathing grace? The painter did not merit death who botched that lovely face. And by Ouyang Xiu. A prince so ill-able to control what went on under his nose must hope in vain to impose his rule on remote barbarian foes. Cousin Lin shows the same originality as these two poets, by presenting each of her subjects in a novel and interesting light. Before she could continue with her disquisition, a servant came in to announce that Jiao Yan was back. His arrival at the Ning mansion had been reported some time ago, and he was expected any moment at Ronghua House. Bao Yu at once got up and, hurrying out to the front part of the mansion, waited inside the main gate for his cousin to arrive. He did not have to wait long. Within moments Jiao Yan was dismounting from his horse and stepping through the gateway. Bao Yu advanced to meet him, touched hand and knee to the ground in greeting, and wished good health, first, as was good manners, to his grandmother and mother, from whom Jiao Yan had come, and then to Jiao Yan himself. The cousins then went inside together, hand in hand. Li Wan, Shi Feng, Bao Chai, Dai Yu, Ying Chun, Tan Chun and Shi Chun were already waiting for Jiao Yan in the hall. After each of them had greeted him individually, he gave them his news. Grandmother will be arriving here early tomorrow. She's been keeping very well on the journey. Today she sent me on ahead to make sure that everything here is all right. I shall be leaving again tomorrow at 4 o'clock in the morning, and going out of the city to meet her. They asked him a few questions about the journey, but because they knew how tired he must be after so much travel, soon left him so that he could go back to his own room and get some rest. About the remainder of that day our narrative is silent. Grandmother Jia and Lady Wang arrived home round about lunchtime the following day. When the initial greetings were over, the old lady sat for a while and sipped a cup of tea before taking Lady Wang and the others with her to Ninghua House. A great wailing rose up as she arrived. Jiaxi and Jialian had gone there after seeing the old lady home, and as she and her party entered the room in which the coffin stood, the two of them advanced to meet her at the head of a number of weeping clansmen, and supported her one on each side as she approached the coffin. At the foot of it Cousin Jin and Jia Rong knelt down, pressing their heads against her skirts and weeping piteously. To people of advancing years even simulated grief is distressing, and Grandmother Jia, an arm about each head, wept very bitterly herself. Jiaxi and Jialian did their best to comfort her, and at last, when her grief had somewhat abated, she moved on, to the right of the coffin screens, where Yusher and her daughter-in-law were waiting for her. Here there was more clinging and weeping, after which those present came forward one by one to salute Grandmother Jia and welcome her in a more normal fashion. Cousin Jin, fearing that Grandmother Jia, who had still not rested properly after her tiring journey, would become distressed if she were to sit much longer in such melancholy surroundings, strongly urged her not to stay. When at last he had prevailed on her to go, and she was back in her own apartment at Ronghua House, it became evident that the shock of mourning, following so soon upon the discomforts of travel, had indeed had an adverse effect on her aging constitution. By nightfall she was showing all the symptoms of incipient illness, heaviness in the head, a constricted feeling in the chest, a blocked-up nose and hoarseness of the voice. The doctor was summoned immediately, and half that night, and the whole of the following day taken up with consultations, prescriptions, and the preparation and administering of medicine. Fortunately the illness had not yet established itself in her system, and responded rapidly to treatment. There was a slight outbreak of perspiration round about midnight of the second night, and after that her pulse and temperature both returned to normal. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief, though to be on the safe side they kept up the dosage for another day. A few days later it was Jia Jing's funeral, in this case no more than the redepositing of his coffin in the family temple. Grandmother Jia was still not well enough to take part, Bao Yu stayed at home to look after his grandmother, and Shi Feng was still insufficiently recovered. Apart from them, all the other members of the Ronghua family, Jiaxi, Jialian, Lady Xing and Lady Wang, together with all the men and women servants of their households, accompanied their Ninghua cousins to the Temple of the Iron Threshold. They were back again that evening, but Cousin Jin, Yusher and Jiarong stayed on at the temple for the 100 days, at the end of which Jia Jing was to be taken to his final resting place in Nanking. Old Mrs. Yu and her two daughters remained all this while at the Ninghua mansion to keep an eye on things. Jialian had heard a good deal in the past about these two stepsisters of Yusher, though, to his great regret, he had never until very recently had an opportunity of meeting them. The opportunity had presented itself on the occasion of Jia Jing's removal into the city. Since then they had become fairly well acquainted. Acquaintanceship in his case, Jialian being what he was, had been accompanied by the first stirrings of lust. He felt encouraged by an unsavory rumor he had heard to the effect that his cousins Jin and Rong, both father and son, had at one time or another enjoyed the sisters' favors. Whenever he had a chance to, he flirted or made eyes at them, unsuccessfully in Sanjia's case, for she met all his advances with indifference, but with a more promising reaction from her sister. Unfortunately, with so many pairs of eyes watching, he could not follow up his success, apart from which he was a little scared that Cousin Jin might be jealous. Between him and Erjie it could be said that there was a silent understanding, but for the time being there could be nothing more. This all changed after the funeral. Then, at Ninghua House, apart from Mrs. Yu and the two sisters, and a few maids and older women employed to do the rough work, hardly anyone from the master apartment was left behind. All the personal maids, parlor maids and concubines stayed with their master and mistress at the temple. As for the married servants, their activities were confined to keeping watch at night and minding the gates by day, and since they had their own quarters outside, they had no reason to go inside the house except when they were on duty. This seemed to Jialian to be an excellent time to act. A pretended wish to keep cousin Jin company at the temple gave him an excuse for absenteeing himself from his own house, whilst the pretext of attending to household matters on cousin Jin's behalf enabled him to make several trips back to Ningwa House, thus providing him with further opportunities for pursuing his flirtation with Erjia. One day Yulu, a junior steward from Ningwa House, came out to see cousin Jin about some business. The total cost of the procession, including funeral furnishings and hire of labor, was 1,110 taels. Of that, 500 taels have already been paid, leaving 610 taels outstanding. Yesterday I had the managers of both agencies round asking me for the rest of the money. I thought I'd better see you about it and ask you what I'm to do. Why didn't you go straight to the counting house and draw what's wanted, said cousin Jin. I don't see why you should need to come bothering me about it. I did go to the counting house, sir, said Yulu, but since Sir Jing passed away they have already paid out so much that they've barely got enough left to pay for the 100 days' services and the expenses of your stay here in the temple. They couldn't pay these bills without eating into what has been earmarked for something else. That's why I've come out to see you. I wondered whether you would want me to pay them out of your personal account, or whether there's some other account you could transfer the money from. If you will let me know what you want me to do, I'll go ahead and do it. Cousin Jin laughed. The days when we had money lying around unused in private accounts have long since passed. You'll have to borrow the money where you can. It was Yulu's turn to laugh. If it were 100 or 200 taels, sir, I might be able to manage something, but 500 or 600. Where would I get a sum like that at short notice? After thinking for a bit, cousin Jin turned to Jia Rong. Go to your mother, Rong, and ask her for that 500 taels the Jins of Nanking sent us after the funeral. It hasn't been handed into the counting house yet. And ask her to have a rake around and see if she can't raise the whole sum. Jia Rong hurried off. In a very short time he was back again with his mother's answer. Mother says 200 of the 500 has already been spent. She sent the remaining 300 back home for grandmother you to take care of. In that case, said cousin Jin, you'd better go back with Yulu to ask her for it, and let him have it. While you're about it, you'll be able to see if everything at home is all right. And of course give my regards to your aunts. Yulu, you'll have to raise the rest of the money as best you can by borrowing. Jia Rong and Yulu promised to do his bidding, but just as they were about to withdraw Jialian walked into the room. Yulu stepped up to him smartly and dropped him a salute. What's happened, said Jialian. Cousin Jin proceeded to explain to him why Yulu was there. As he did so, it occurred to Jialian that this would be a good opportunity of going to the Ningwa mansion and looking up Erjia again. It seems a pity to go straining one's credit for so trifling a sum, he said. I had a little windfall the other day that I haven't made use of yet. Why don't I let him have that to add to your 300 and save him the trouble of borrowing? That will be splendid, said cousin Jin. Perhaps you will authorize Rong to pick it up then, when he goes to collect the 300? I think it will be necessary to go for it myself, said Jialian hurriedly. In any case I haven't been home for some days. I really ought to drop in and pay my respects to grandmother and Lady Wang and my parents. I shall be able to look in at your place too, Zhen, and make sure that your servants are behaving themselves. And pay my respects to your mother-in-law, of course. It means imposing on you once again, said cousin Jin, smiling. I don't know whether I should let you. For goodness sake, said Jialian. One's own cousin. Go with your uncle, then, cousin Jin instructed Jia Rong, and when you see Lady Jia, and the other ladies, and Sir Shi to make your bow to them, remember to say that your mother, and I send them our regards. And don't forget to ask whether Lady Jia is quite better yet, and whether or not she is still taking medicine. Having read each one of these commands, Jia Rong followed his uncle Lian outside. The two of them then took horse and, accompanied by Yulu and several pages, all on horseback, rode out towards the city. As Erjia was very much on his mind, Jiao Yan beguiled the journey by talking to his nephew about her as they rode along. He spoke approvingly of her good looks and gentle character. He remarked what perfect poise she had, and what a soft and pleasing way of speaking. In fact, he concluded, everything about her excited one's admiration and respect. Everyone speaks so highly of your Aunt Feng, but to my mind she isn't a patch on her. Jiao Rong understood very well where this conversation was leading them. If you love her so much, uncle, he said, why not let me be your matchmaker and arrange for you to have her as your number 2? Is that a joke, said Jiao Yan, or are you in earnest? I'm being perfectly serious. Jiao Yan laughed. It's certainly an attractive proposal. The only trouble is, I don't think your Aunt Feng would ever stand for it. And besides, your grandmother you might not be willing. And haven't I heard somewhere that your Aunt Air is already engaged to someone? None of these is really a problem, said Jiao Rong. Aunt Air and Aunt San, although they took his surname, were not really my Grandpa Yu's daughters. When Gran married my Grandpa Yu as his second wife, she brought them with her from a previous marriage. I've heard Gran say that when she was carrying Aunt Air, her first husband had an agreement with a friend of his called Zhang, who was a manager on one of the imperial farms and whose own wife was also pregnant at the time. They agreed that if the children their wives were carrying turned out to be a boy and a girl, they should be betrothed to each other. In that way Aunt Air was engaged to the Zhang's boy from the moment she was born. Later on the Zhangs lost all their money in a lawsuit, and Gran lost her first husband and married my Grandpa Yu, and for 10 or 15 years now she hasn't heard a word from them. She often complains about the betrothal, and says she wishes she could get it revoked, and father is anxious to betroth Aunt Air to someone else. He's only waiting until he has found the right person, and then he means to find out where the Zhangs are, hand them a small sum of money, and persuade them to sign a deed of revocation. The Zhangs are so poor, they are hardly likely to refuse. In fact, when they've seen the kind of people we are, they probably won't dare. And whatever father and Gran might have thought about Aunt Air becoming a number 2 in other circumstances, I'm sure they would have no objection in your case. The only difficulty as I see it is Aunt Feng. Jiao Yan was so enraptured by the main part of what Jiao Rong had been saying, that it is doubtful whether he heard those last words at all. For some moments he rode on in silence, a fatuous grin on his face. Meanwhile Jiao Rong was thinking. I'll tell you what, uncle, he said presently, if you've got the nerve, there's one way of doing this that would be absolutely foolproof. It would involve you in spending a bit of money though. Never mind that, dear boy, said Jiao Yan eagerly. If you have a plan, just tell me what it is. Don't say anything about this when we arrive, said Jiao Rong, but wait until I have had a chance to explain it all to father, and he can arrange it with my Gran. When it's all settled, buy a little house somewhere in the streets at the back of our mansion, furnish it, install 1 or 2 married couples to look after it, and then all you have to do is choose the day. You can marry Aunt Air then, and nobody be any the wiser. Of course, you'd have to impress on the servants that they are not to let on about it, but provided they don't talk, there's no reason why Aunt Feng tucked away in the inner courtyards should ever hear about it. And by the time you've been living together for a year or 2, you ought to be able to ride the storm out even if your secret is blown. You'd have to face an explosion from Sir Shi, of course, but you can tell him that you did it for the family, because Aunt Feng is unable to have a son. And as for Aunt Feng herself, when she sees that the rice is cooked and knows that it can't be uncooked, she'll have to put up with it. That only leaves the old lady to square, and you should be able to do that easily enough with a bit of coaxing. There is an old saying, desire maketh the wise man a fool. Jiao Yan was so intoxicated by his desire for Erjie that Jiao Rong's idiotic plan struck him as unassailable. The fact that he was in mourning, the fact that a secret marriage of the kind he was contemplating was bigamous and illegal, the fact that he had an extremely strict father and an exceptionally jealous wife, all those things which ought to have given him pause were lightly brushed aside. Nor did it occur to him that Jiao Rong's counsel was by no means disinterested. Jiao Rong had designs upon Erjie himself, to which the presence of his father, when they were all together in the same house, was an impediment. If Jiao Yan married Erjie, she would have to live outside, and there would be unlimited opportunities for larks with her whenever Jiao Lian was away. Blind to all this, Jiao Lian thanked Jiao Rong profusely and promised him a suitable reward. If you can really arrange this for me, dear boy, I'll buy you a pair of the prettiest little girls who are to be had, and make you a present of them. They were by now approaching the gates of Ningguo House. You go in here and ask my gran for the money to give to you, Lu, uncle. I'm going on to the other house to pay my respects to the old lady. Jiao Lian smiled and nodded. When you see her, don't let on that I came here with you, will you? All right, said Jiao Rong, then, leaning over, he added in a low voice in his uncle's ear, if you should happen to see Aunt Air today, don't let impatience get the better of you. A scandal now will make it harder to arrange things later. Cheeky devil, said Jiao Lian laughing. Go on, be on your way now. I'll be waiting for you here. While Jiao Rong went on to the Rong mansion alone, Jiao Lian turned into the gateway of Ningguo House. The men servants temporarily in charge there were waiting inside the gate to welcome him, with the other servants all lined up behind them. They clustered round him as he made his way up to the hall. There, for form's sake, he asked them a few perfunctory questions before dismissing them, and continuing on his way to the inner apartments. As cousins and intimates having no secrets from one another, Cousin Jin and Jiao Lian had always felt free to come and go in each other's apartments without formality, and so, when Jiao Lian approached the main sitting room of Cousin Jin's apartment, the old women at the door simply raised the portiere for him, and let him go in unannounced. Looking round him as he entered, Jiao Lian saw only Erjia and a couple of maids sewing together on the Kong at the southern end of the room. The mother and the other sister were not in evidence. He went up and greeted her. In response to her smiling invitation to join her, he climbed up and sat with his back resting against the openwork partition along the eastern side of the Kong, insisting that Erjia should take the place of honor. After a few generalities, he asked her where Mrs. Yu and Sanjia were. Just gone out the back to see about something, said Erjia. They'll be here again in a moment. The maids now went outside to fetch tea, leaving the two of them alone together. Jiao Lian ogled Erjia meaningfully, but she merely smiled, keeping her eyes demurely downwards, and pretended not to notice. At this stage, he judged, a physical advance would be premature. He noticed that as she sat there her hands were continuously playing with a length of silk handkerchief to which a tiny embroidered bag was attached. To fill in the embarrassed silence that was developing, he pretended to be feeling for something at his waist. Oh, I've come out without my beetle. Give me some beetle, my dear, if you've got any. I have got some, said Erjia, but it's not for other people. Jiao Lian laughed and made a movement towards her, as if he intended to snatch the handkerchief and its little pouch from her by force, whereupon Erjia, rather than risk someone coming in and finding them in the midst of an unseemly tussle, threw it across to him with a little laugh. Jiao Lian caught it in midair, emptied the contents into the palm of his hand, selected one single half-eaten nut which he popped into his mouth, and began chewing, and stuffed all the rest back into the bag. He was just going to hand it back to her when the two maids came in again with the tea. Jiao Lian took a cup from one of them, and began sipping it. While the maids were not looking, he contrived to unfasten a Han jade girdle pendant in the form of 9 tiny interlocking dragons that he wore attached to his belt, tie it onto the handkerchief and toss it back for Erjia to catch. But Erjia pretended not to have noticed. She allowed the handkerchief with the 2 small objects attached to it to fall beside her on the Kong, and went on calmly sipping her tea. Just then there was a rattle of the portiere and old Mrs. Yu and Sanjia came into the room from the back, attended by 2 little maids. Jiao Lian signaled with his eyes to Erjia that she should pick the handkerchief up, but Erjia continued to ignore him. In somewhat of a panic by now, and wondering what Erjia could be at, he rose to his feet and advanced to meet Sanjia and the old lady. When, after exchanging courtesies with them, he glanced back behind him, Erjia was standing unconcernedly in the same place, with the same inscrutable smile on her face, but the handkerchief had vanished. He breathed a sigh of relief. When they were all seated, and a few pleasantries had been exchanged between them, Jiao remembered the business on which he was supposed to have come. Jun's wife says that she sent a packet of silver to you the other day to look after for her. It's wanted now to pay some bills with, so Jun has sent me to ask you for it, and also to find out if everything at home is all right. Mrs. Yu at once told Erjia to take the key of the chest and fetch the money for her. I'm also glad of the opportunity my errand gives me of offering you my respects, ma'am, and of seeing the young ladies again, Jiao continued after Erjia had gone. I must say, you are looking extremely well. But I am sorry the young ladies should have to put up with the inconvenience of moving into a strange house. Tut, for one's own kin, said Mrs. Yu, smiling. You are too polite, Mr. Lien. It's of no consequence where we stay, one bed is as good as another. To tell you the truth, things have been very difficult for us since Mr. Yu passed away. If it hadn't been for the help given us by my daughter's husband, I really don't know how we should have managed. To look after the house for him in his time of trouble is the very least we can do in return. It can certainly not be spoken of as an inconvenience. Erjia had now returned with the silver and handed it to her mother handed it to Jiao, and Jiao ordered one of the maids to call in one of the old women from outside, whom he then instructed to take it to Yulu and tell him to wait for him in the front. While the old woman was going off with the money, Jiao voice could be heard outside in the courtyard, and a few moments later he appeared. He greeted his grandmother and two aunts before turning with a smile to Jiao. Sir, she has been asking about you, uncle. He says there's something he wants you to do for him. He was going to send someone to fetch you from the temple, but I told him you were already on your way into the city. He told me that if I ran into you on my way back, I was to tell you to hurry. Jiao hastily rose to go, but delayed to hear something that Jiao was saying to Mrs. Yu. You know, the other day I was telling you that father has found a husband for Aunt Gran. In looks and build he has quite a strong resemblance to Uncle Lien. Does that please you? Since he was pointing a finger at Jiao and simultaneously making a face at Erjia, while he said this, the question appeared to be meant as much for Erjia as for her mother. If so, Erjia was too embarrassed to answer. Not so her sister, however. Little monster! Sanjia shouted, half angrily and half in jest. Keep your dirty little mouth shut, unless you want me to come over and shut it for you. Jiao retreated, laughing, from the room, and Jiao, taking a laughing farewell of the old lady and her daughters, went out after him. He stopped in the hall again on his way out to admonish the servants, not to gamble, not to drink, and so forth. Then, after a private aside with Jiao in which he urged him to return with all speed to the temple and speak about a certain matter to his father, he went with Yulu to the other mansion and gave him the balance of the amount owing. Having dispatched Yulu, he went in to see what his father wanted, and after that to grandmother Jia's apartment to pay his respects. But these are formalities with which we need not concern ourselves. We return, then, to the Ningwa mansion, where Jiao, concluding, when he saw Yulu go off with Jiao, that there was nothing more for him to do, went back to the inner apartments for further badinage with his young aunts before setting off once more for the temple. It was evening when he arrived there and reported back to his father. Yulu got the money all right. And Lady Jia is now completely recovered. She is no longer taking medicine. He availed himself of the opportunity to tell his father about Jiao, how, on the journey into town, he had expressed a desire to take Erjia as his number 2, and how he proposed to set her up in a separate establishment, keeping Shifeng in ignorance of the marriage. His sole reason for taking a number 2, Jiao explained, is that he wants a son. And the reason he particularly wants an heir is because he feels it would be better to keep things in the family and have someone he knows than risk taking some unknown person from outside. He was very insistent that I should speak to you about this. He omitted to mention that he was the author of this plan. Cousin Jen, after reflecting on it, seemed well disposed. Actually, it's not a bad idea. I wonder whether your Aunt Heir would be willing, though. You'd better go in again tomorrow and have a word with your grandmother Yu. Tell her to talk to your Aunt Heir about it and see if she accepts. If she does, we can go ahead and fix it up properly." After a good deal more advice to Jiarong on how he was to conduct himself, Cousin Jin went inside to see Yusher and told her about the plan. Yusher could see at once that it would not work and did her best to dissuade him, but Cousin Jin's mind was made up, and in the end, since she was accustomed to giving in to him, and since Ergia was in any case only a stepsister, for whom therefore she felt only limited responsibility, she allowed the menfolk to go ahead and washed her hands of the whole affair. Jiarong went into town next morning and told his grandmother what his father had told him to say. He also added a good deal of his own. He told her what a capital person Jiao Yen was, how Shifeng was ill and not expected to get better, how Jiao Yen was planning to buy a house outside and install Ergia in it temporarily, but how in a year or two, as soon as Shifeng was dead, he would move her inside and make her his number one. He went on to tell her about the gifts Cousin Jin would give for the betrothal, and of the wedding presents that Jiao Yen was planning for his bride, how Jiao Yen was prepared to look after Mrs. Yu in her old age, and how in due course he would see Sanjia provided with a husband. The Liang dynasty preacher on whom the heavens rained down flowers could not have spoken with greater eloquence. Mrs. Yu could hardly fail to agree, particularly in view of the fact that she depended on Cousin Jin for her livelihood, and that it was he who was sponsoring the marriage. And Jiao Yen was such a fine young gentleman, infinitely superior to that Zhang boy. She would go to Ergia at once and talk it over with her. Yu Ergia was a highly impressionable young woman. Already, in the past, she had compromised herself with her sister's husband. And she had always resented the arbitrary betrothal to Zhang Hua, as the Zhang's boy was called, which seemed to condemn her to a lifetime of poverty. If Jiao Yen loved her and her brother-in-law was prepared to give her away, what possible objection could she have to the marriage? Her consent was given with a nod, conveyed at once to Jiarong by her mother, and in due course reported to Cousin Jin. Next day Cousin Jin invited Jiao Yen to the temple to hear from his own lips that Mrs. Yu had consented. Jiao Yen, delighted that the matter had been settled with so little trouble, at once began discussing what to do. Agents had to be engaged to look round for a suitable house, jewelry for Ergia's trousseau had to be ordered, and furnishings had to be purchased for the house. Within a few days all this had been done. A 20-frame house in Little Flower Lane about 2/3 of a mile north of 2 Duke Street had been bought, furnished throughout, and 2 little maids purchased to go with it. Jiao Yen was at first uncertain what to do about older servants. If he used servants from his own household, their transfer was sure to be detected. On the other hand, a married couple purchased from outside would be strangers, and therefore of uncertain loyalty and impossible to trust. Suddenly he remembered Bao Er, whose unfortunate wife had hanged herself after being attacked by Shifeng in a fit of jealous rage. At the time Jiao Yen had given him some money and promised him a new wife. The wife he had eventually chosen for him was none other than the mattress, widowed since the drunken cook Droopy Duo had finally drunk himself to death. Bao Er had had prior experience of her charms and knew that he was getting a good bargain, and the mattress for her part was glad to be married to someone who, thanks to Jiao Yen's subvention, could afford to be free with his money. This couple, united in their loyalty to Jiao Yen and dislike of Shifeng, seemed an ideal choice for the new establishment and were to their immense satisfaction installed in it, along with the newly purchased maids, to be at Ergia's disposal when she arrived. There remained only the matter of Zhang Hua to be dealt with. It was Zhang Hua's grandfather who had originally held the managerial post on one of the imperial farms. His father simply inherited the post when the old man died. While holding it, he had made the arrangement with Mrs. Yu's first husband, who was his good friend, as a result of which Zhang Hua and Ergia were engaged to each other from their earliest infancy. Some time after that he lost all his possessions in a lawsuit, and the family were reduced to penury so dire that even food and clothing were a problem, and taking on a new daughter-in-law was, for the time being, wholly out of the question. Then Ergia's mother had remarried, and for 14 years or more they had been completely out of touch. Their whereabouts were eventually traced, however, and Zhang Hua's father summoned to Ningguo House, and induced to sign a deed of revocation releasing Ergia from her betrothal. He did not want to sign it, but was too intimidated by cousin Jin's air of affluence and authority to object. After he had signed, Mrs. Yu handed him 20 taels, and that was that. Everything had now been taken care of. All that remained was for Jiao Yan to name the day. The calendar was consulted, and the 3rd of the 6th month, which was just beginning, was found to be the earliest auspicious day. On that day, it was decided, Jie should be received as a bride in her new home. But for that event you must await the following chapter.